Hi everyone, I'm Amy. Today, let's look at some common ways for people to address each other and themselves in the Imperial Palace of ancient China. And while we're at it, we'll also go over the terms that appear in popular palace dramas, because it turns out that some of them were never actually used in the real Imperial Palace at all. Who knows, what if you transmigrate to ancient China one day? This could be useful. Did you notice that in CDramas, people rarely use the words for I or you? This is actually a fairly accurate representation of how people refer to themselves and each other in ancient China. Now, the standard I or you were still used in informal or intimate contexts, but based on conversations recorded in historical records, people usually used a completely different set of words, depending on the situation. These were terms that told everyone in the room exactly who you were. In the Imperial Palace, you may have heard the use of 妾 from a woman, which literally means this concubine, or someone using the term 臣, which literally means your subject. Even outside of the palace, a younger brother, a servant, or even a friend could all use different terms to clearly signal their relationship to the person that they were speaking to. But most of them shared one thing in common. They were generally self-deprecating. It was a reflection of a Confucian moral ideal, that a person of good character should always present themselves with humility. No matter your rank, no matter your power, you were expected to make yourself smaller in the presence of others. Well, except for the emperor. In the social hierarchy of ancient China, language was carefully calibrated to reflect rank, relationship, gender, and sometimes even how much favor you currently held. And this worked in both directions, the words you used to refer to yourself and the words others used to address you. Get either one wrong, and everyone in the room would notice. And nowhere was this more complicated than inside the Imperial Palace. Let's start at the very top. How did the emperor refer to himself? The most common term that you may have heard is 朕. When Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, unified China, he wanted to standardize everything: weights, measures, the written script, and even the words of the emperor himself. He decided that 朕 would be the word exclusively used by the emperor when referring to himself. But interestingly, he didn't create this word. Before the Qing dynasty, 朕 was actually a neutral first-person pronoun that appears in classical texts as far back as the Zhou dynasty, roughly equivalent to 我, which is the common term for I. You see it in written sources like bronze inscriptions and classical texts. Though we don't know exactly how it was used in everyday spoken language, Qin Shi Huang changed all of that by declaring that he was the one and only person allowed to use this word. From that point on, if anyone else in the empire dared to call himself 朕, he was basically announcing himself as a rebel. And that was the kind of mistake you didn't live to repeat. So the power of 朕 doesn't come from its meaning, it came from exclusivity. Also interesting is that contrary to most other terms of self-referral in ancient China, 朕 did not have any self-deprecating properties. Think of it more as an exalted kind of a royal I. Instead of lowering the speaker, it elevated them. In addition to 朕, there were older, more traditional ways for a ruler to refer to himself. A king could call himself 寡人, literally meaning lacking in virtue, or 孤, the solitary one. These terms were properly self-deprecating, presenting the ruler as morally insufficient in line with Confucian ideals. And they weren't exclusive to the emperor. Vassal kings and other rulers used them too. So those were the ways the emperor spoke about himself. But what about everyone else? How did they speak to him? The most standard and widely used term was 陛下, which basically means your majesty. But the literal meaning of 陛下 is a little more abstract. 陛 refers to the steps leading up to the throne, and 下 meaning below or under. So 陛下 literally means below the steps. So when officials said 陛下, they weren't addressing the emperor directly. Instead, they were addressing the space below him. It reflects a deep cultural rule. You do not call the emperor directly, you position yourself lower, both physically and linguistically. You weren't speaking to the emperor, you were speaking beneath him. The humility and respect was built into the word itself. 陛下 was the standard formal address, but there were also some other terms. First, there is 皇上, which means the emperor above, kind of like referring to the emperor as the emperor, instead of your majesty. This term was slightly more inner circle and started to appear in later dynasties. While still very respectful, it carries a tone of being closer to the emperor, and was more commonly used by his consorts, officials, and close personal attendants in less formal settings. We see this used often in CDrama, but 陛下 was actually more typical according to historical records. Then there is 圣上, which means the Holy One above. This was an extremely formal and reverent way to address the emperor. It could be used in very formal settings, especially ceremonial speech, but more often appears as a respectful reference rather than a direct address. So in most everyday contexts, it is usually something you would say about the emperor, not necessarily something you would say to him. Those were the terms of address that we can see across all of the dynasties. But there were also some terms that were created and used just in a specific dynasty. First, there is 圣人, which means the sage or the saint. We see this most commonly in the Tang dynasty and sometimes in the Song dynasty. Most of the time, it appears as a reverent third-person title, talking about the emperor as someone who should embody perfect moral wisdom. But in especially deferential speech, it could also be used as a direct address, leaning hard into that Confucian ideal that the ruler should be the most morally upright person in the world. In the Tang dynasty, close attendants, eunuchs, and sometimes consorts could also use the term 大家 as an informal way of referring to the emperor. In modern Chinese, 大家 literally means everybody. But back then, it was a way to refer to the emperor as the head of the household, which leads us to 官家, which literally means the official household. This was used to refer to the emperor in the Song dynasty, and it leaned into the idea that the emperor should treat the entire government and empire as his family, merging public office with private household. In Song dynasty sources, the term 官家 carried a slightly more conversational and formal tone, and was often used by palace attendants, eunuchs, and even officials in less formal settings. Compared to 陛下, 官家 feels more administrative than ceremonial, but it was still respectful. And then there is 万岁, which means 10,000 years. This started out as a shouted blessing, which essentially said, long live the emperor, and was not a standard form of address. But by the Qing dynasty, it also became part of a direct address in the form of 万岁爷, meaning Lord of 10,000 years. This was mostly used by servants and eunuchs as a way to combine the blessing with a respectful address. From the below the steps of the throne to the Lord of 10,000 years, every single word used to address the emperor was carefully designed to remind everyone in the room exactly where they stood in relation to him. Now let's head to the Imperial Harem. How did a consort refer to herself? The most common form that you may have heard is 妾, which literally means this concubine. Originally, the word 妾 referred to a female slave or woman punished for a crime. Over time, it evolved to become the legal term for concubine or secondary wife. But when used as a form of self-address, a consort wasn't literally calling herself a concubine. Instead, it was more like a humble I, a way of positioning herself as subservient rather than simply saying I or me. And this wasn't just reserved for speaking to the emperor. A consort could use 妾 when speaking to anyone of similar or higher status. An empress speaking to a higher-ranking government official or foreign diplomat could still refer to herself as 妾. But if she was speaking to someone much lower in status, she may simply use the normal 我 instead. And 妾 wasn't just an imperial palace thing either. All women could use this term. A merchant's wife speaking to her husband, a daughter-in-law speaking to her father-in-law. even a woman in a village speaking to her elders. The humility it carried was expected of women across every level of society. Sometimes additional words were added to 妾 to create a stronger effect. For example, 贱妾 could be used as an even more intense version, possibly used if the woman was pleading or apologizing. And 妾身 could be used as a more literary and emotional form. But it was seen more often in poetry and stylized writing than in everyday speech. Now, 妾 appears constantly across all of Chinese history. But if you watched a lot of C-dramas, you probably have heard some other terms that sound very official and very ancient. So let's talk about those, because some of them were probably never actually used in real Chinese history at all. First, there is 奴家, which literally means this slave. You may have heard this used in stories set in the Tang or the Song dynasty. But here's the thing, we don't actually have evidence of 奴家 being used as a standard self-address in those periods. The term mostly appears in fictional stories written during the Ming and Qing dynasties, and then got carried backwards into earlier settings by storytellers. So if you see it in a Tang dynasty drama, that's the drama taking some creative liberties. Then there is 臣妾. If you have watched shows set in the Qing dynasty, such as Ruyi's Royal Love in the Palace or Story of Yanxi Palace, you have definitely heard this one. It combines 臣, meaning your subject, with 妾, meaning this concubine, to create something like your humble subject concubine. It sounds very formal and very period accurate. But there is no evidence that 臣妾 was ever used as a standard form of spoken self-address. There are a handful of records of it appearing in ceremonial documents, but even there it was rare. Next is 本宫, which literally means this palace. We often see this used by high-ranking women like the Empress or a favorite consort, using the idea that she is so powerful she represents her entire palace. It sounds very grand. But similar to 臣妾, there is no evidence of 本宫 being used as a real self-reference in historical records. It appears to have been made up through Yuan Dynasty opera, and then got picked up and passed down through fictional storytelling from there. And then there is 哀家, also commonly seen in C-drama based on the Qing Dynasty. This one is used by the Empress Dowager to refer to herself. And the 哀 in the 哀家 means mourning or grief. The idea is that the Empress Dowager is a widow, and so she carries that sorrow in the way she refers to herself. Beautiful and poetic. But unfortunately, there is also no evidence of any Empress Dowager calling herself 哀家 in any court records. It appears to be a theatrical invention that C-dramas have turned into one of the most recognizable phrases of the Imperial Palace. So it turns out some of the most iconic terms that we see from C-dramas were never actually spoken in the Imperial Palace at all. Next, let's talk about how other people would refer to an imperial consort. The most common term that you may have heard is 娘娘, which basically means Her Highness or My Lady. This was usually combined with the consort's actual rank. The empress would be 皇后娘娘. The noble consort would be 贵妃娘娘. The Empress Dowager would be 太后娘娘. But what's interesting is that 娘娘 wasn't really standardized until sometime after the Tang Dynasty. During the Tang Dynasty, 娘娘 was actually more commonly used to refer to your mother or an older woman. Instead, they would refer to an imperial consort as 娘子. After the Tang Dynasty, once they standardized using 娘娘 for imperial consorts, the term 娘子 changed to be used for a man's wife instead. Being the emperor's child came with its own set of rules. And just like everyone else in the palace, that included how you refer to yourself. The most common term you may have seen from C-dramas when a prince or princess speaks to the emperor is probably 儿臣, which literally means your child subject. It combines 儿, meaning child, with 臣, meaning subject or servant. And on the surface, it makes perfect sense. It captures both relationships at once. I am your child, and I am also under your authority. But here's the thing. there is no official record of 儿臣 ever being used in actual historical documents. Just like 本宫, this appears to be another term that was invented through fiction and then repeated so many times it started to feel real. Instead, in most dynasties, a prince could refer to himself as 儿 or 臣 as separate terms, depending on the context. A princess could refer to herself as 儿 or 臣女, meaning your subject daughter. And in the Qing dynasty, we see the use of 子臣, which carries essentially the same meaning as 儿臣, your child subject. And of course, in private and non-official settings, a prince or princess could simply use the normal I, like everyone else. Now, how did others address them? For the most part, a prince or princess would simply be referred to by their title or rank. But there was also a formal honorific reserved for them, 殿下, which basically means Your Highness. The literal meaning of 殿下 is below the steps of the palace, which may feel very similar to the meaning of the emperor's term 陛下, and you would be right. The literal meaning is similar. The thinking was that princes and princesses with their own palaces still deserves a below-the-palace honorific, but it must be distinct from the emperors. So they get 殿下. In early dynasties, this was usually reserved for the crown prince and other high-ranking princes, but eventually would become the standard formal honorific for princes and princesses for almost all of the dynasties. That is until the Qing dynasty changed things again. With the Manchu influence came new everyday terms, 阿哥 for prince and 哥哥 for princess. 哥哥 was used in a lot of other cases too, but we won't get into that here. If you have watched any Qing dynasty dramas, you have definitely heard both of these. And unlike some of the other terms we talked about today, these ones are actually historically accurate. In the early dynasties, eunuchs would actually refer to themselves as 臣. Yes, the same term a prince or a government official would use. At that point in history, 臣 simply meant subject. And eunuchs, as servants of the emperor, presented themselves the same way. It wasn't a mark of status, it was a mark of loyalty. Female servants weren't treated as subjects in the same way though. A palace maid or low-ranking woman would commonly refer to themselves as 奴婢, which literally meant slave. But similar to the way consorts used 妾, this wasn't literally calling herself a slave. It was a way of showing deference, of making herself as small as possible in the presence of those above her. Starting from the Tang dynasty, lower-ranked eunuchs began using 奴婢 as well, creating a distinction between themselves and the higher-ranked eunuchs who still used 臣. By the Ming dynasty, this distinction was formalized, with 臣 restricted to only the highest-ranked eunuchs. And then in the Qing dynasty, eunuchs, bondservants, and some low-ranked banner officials began referring to themselves as 奴才. 奴才 still basically meant slave, but it reintroduced a gender-based distinction, separating the male servant from the female servant who continued to use 奴婢. If consorts speak with strategy, servants of the imperial palace speak with submission. I know my place, and I pose no threat. And the further down you were, the smaller you made yourself sound. In some CDramas, we see the use of 杂家 by high-ranking eunuchs. This one is interesting because 杂家 was actually a widely used first-person pronoun starting from the Song dynasty and was not restricted to eunuchs at all. It was used by all kinds of people. So while it sounds very specific and official in CDramas, historically, it was just a fairly common way of saying I. Now, how did others address eunuchs and palace maids? In the earlier dynasties, eunuchs and palace servants were generally referred to by the name of their office or position rather than any special honorific. But starting from the Ming dynasty, we began to see 公公 used for higher-ranked or senior eunuchs, and 姑姑 for senior palace maids. Isn't it interesting that so many terms we see in C-dramas weren't actually used in the real imperial palace? What we see in the C-dramas today is often a version of history filtered through centuries of storytelling, refined on the opera stage, polished in novels. and finally cemented on screen. These terms weren't chosen because they were historically accurate, but because they sound right, elegant, emotional, and instantly recognizable. The real court, by contrast, was far more restrained. Language there followed strict hierarchies, ritual rules, and unspoken boundaries. It was maybe less poetic, but far more precise. Every word carried weight. The way you referred to yourself told people your rank, your relationship, and exactly how much of a threat you were willing to appear to be. Sometimes it shifted depending on who walked into the room. Sometimes a single term could mean the difference between respect and insubordination. And sometimes the difference between what sounds right and what actually is right is where the most interesting story is hiding. What do you think about these honorifics? Which one surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments if you liked today's topic. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.